for the development legacy of statelessness. We like to begin all of our grand challenges by remembering the many millions of people that we have gathered here on behalf of, several of who are not permitted to travel here to be with us. So may I please ask you to set aside your phones and connect your hearts and minds with not just the complex issues of statelessness, but the people of statelessness. We read you the words of Abigail Carl Klassen. Why is the government doing this? Because that's the law, and that's what the law states. This is a technique that no one hopes will be used extensively or for very long. We're a country of law and order. Let every soul be subjected to the higher powers, for there is no power but God. The powers that be are ordained by God. These laws have been on the books for decades. We don't want this to be a problem. The president has tried to address it on a number of occasions. Illegal entry into the United States is a crime. It should be. It must be. Render there to all their duties, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom is due, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. It's the president's job to enforce the law. I thought I'd take a bit of digression here to discuss some concerns raised by our church friends about separation of families. Orderly and lawful processes are good in themselves and protect the weak and the lawful. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordain of God, and they that resist shall receive themselves to damnation. It's a moral policy to follow and enforce the law. That's not what I said. I know it's hard for you to understand, even short sentences, I guess, but please, don't take my words out of context. I would cite to you the Apostle Paul and his clear and wise command in Romans 13 to obey the laws of the government, because God has ordained them for the purpose of order. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Thank you.
All right. I prefer not to use microphone. Is everyone all right to hear my speaking voice? I'm looking at the back. Is it on now? Yes. Thank you, Amal. That's a good point. All right, once again, welcome very much to this 8th challenge session, the development legacy of statelessness. I want to just set a bit of a tone here in the beginning, and looking at the idea that the core focus of the 2030 development agenda for sustainable development is that no one must be left behind. Now, we must remember this is not simply a rallying cry, but it is a statement of principle that pushes the development community, its champions, its funders, its implementers, to go beyond good enough solutions. It underscores the fact that these people who struggle most to access the benefits of development, those who are hardest to reach, those who fall between the rubrics of our log frames, these are the very people that we must prioritize in our international development agendas and frameworks. But as we have all learned in these last 3 days, not only are the stateless not prioritized, they're often not even considered. Statelessness renders people invisible to development actors, political movements, and government systems because the stateless are simply not counted. And here I'm reminded about the work of James C. Scott and his book on Seen Like a State, which looks at the state's campaign to render society legible. We are forced to remain mindful of the fact that so much of a person's quality of life in today's world is determined by whether or not the state sees them and deems them entitled to the public goods that they distribute. Those goods can include education, sanitation, and health, but they're also fundamentally routes of access for security, justice, the right to political representation, and often even mobility. To put it succinctly, in our state-ordered world, nationality acts as a gateway through which people access the components of a healthy, safe, and productive life. So in essence, these are actually the very core aims of the entire international development enterprise. So understanding that, how do we ensure that stateless communities are not left behind? In this morning's panel, we are going to have a little journey through this theme, pausing at different junctures and stages of intervention, and look at how these stages illustrate the multiple facets of this topic and how it is experienced by people around the globe. We'll begin by examining the central dilemma, and that's applying a development agenda in a state-centric world order, and how is it possible to reach those who are not recognized by the state. We'll then zoom in to wrestle with the complexity of getting this issue of statelessness on the radar of major development actors, be they states or multilateral organizations. Next, we'll move to problematize that approach by hearing how these development actors and agendas may themselves be exacerbating the problem of statelessness. We'll then move to a post-stateless scenario, hearing a case in which the statelessness has been resolved, nationality has been acquired, but discuss whether or not effort is still needed to help these people catch up and address the longer-term enduring legacy of statelessness. And we'll round off in the end with a little bit of a counterpoint, examining whether or not there are viable models for development, progress, and modernization that operate outside the framework of the nation state. So with that, I'd like to introduce my esteemed panelists in the order in which they will present. So we'll begin with Christoph Sperreveld. Christoph is a senior research fellow at Peter McMullen Center on Statelessness at Melbourne Law School. Prior to this, Christoph was deputy director at the Asian International Justice Initiative, which is a joint program of the East-West Center and Stanford University. But Christoph came to this research life via a career in development cooperation. And from 2007 to 2011, he was based in Cambodia, where he was a senior advisor to GIZ, the German International Development Agency. Next, we will hear from Diana Gishengo. Diana is the program manager on identity and inclusion at the Kenyan Human Rights Commission. She is a lawyer by profession who has centered her practice on freedom from discrimination, leveraging her strong experience in citizenship and nationality, as well as human rights and political participation. And she was a driving activist in the 2016 four-day trek of the Makonde people, an unrecognized population from Kenya. And they moved from Mombasa to Nairobi. And if anyone needs a little bit of an inspiration on those days where you feel that your work isn't amounting to anything, I recommend watching Journey of the Makonde to Citizenship. It just gives you a little kick of seeing where activism can actually make an impact, and it's quite beautiful. We will then hear from Amanda Flame. Amanda is an assistant professor at the James Madison College of Public Affairs and the Department of Sociology at Michigan State University, with affiliations in the Center for Asian Studies and the Center for Gender in Global Context. She has formerly served as the lead director of statelessness research for UNESCO, ESCAP, and for UNHCR in Nepal. Her work combines extensive survey data with multiscalar ethnographic research to map the causes, conditions, and consequences of statelessness. Fourth, we will hear from Rahana Mohammed. Rahana is a team leader for legal research at Verite Research, which is a strategic analysis think tank in Colombo, where Rahana has led the research project focused specifically on the enduring impact of statelessness and how it has affected upcountry Tamils, a formerly stateless group who received national citizenship in 2003. And finally, we will end with a presentation by Dawn Chatty. Dawn is the emeritus professor in anthropology and forced migration and the former director of the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford. Her research interests include coping strategies and resilience of refugee youth, tribes and tribalism, nomadic pastoralism, and conservation. She has worked with nomadic pastoral groups in Lebanon and Syria since the mid-1970s and has extended her research to Oman in 1979. She has continued to work with these communities and has engaged in advocacy for the rights of these people to remain mobile and to resist forced settlement. So with that, we will begin our presentations. Just to let you know a few ground rules, after each individual presentation, there will be a moment for questions for clarification, but I'll be very strict here. These are simply, if you didn't understand a term or an acronym used, they are short, brief clarification questions. After all 5 presentations have been given, we will then open up for discussion, Q&A, and more provocative, thought-provoking questions. So with that, let me turn over to Christoph to kick us off.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is not just a journey across different topics, it's also a journey across the world. We start the journey in Cambodia this morning. What I will be talking about is it here? Now I'm getting it. Is work with ethnic Vietnamese minority populations in Cambodia that I've been engaged with since roughly 2008. It's a population that came across in my work while I was working for the GIZ, and I have been involved in different capacities over the years. The story with the ethnic Vietnamese minority in Cambodia will sound to you not very dissimilar to what we have heard from our colleagues from Myanmar as well, where there exist in Cambodia similar tensions with the minority population. What I thought to do in my presentation to bring some of these experience and conversation with the topic of the panel. To begin with, I think grand challenges are best highlighted with like small stories. So I will tell you like a story of Jung Hyun, who I met first. I had a photo here of Jung Hyun, but because we are live streaming, you just see the community where Jung Hyun is living. So Jung Hyun was born in 1962 in Cambodia from a Vietnamese father and a Khmer Chinese mother. Because he had a Vietnamese name, he was always more perceived by his environment to be Vietnamese than Cambodian, even though he had probably both. He grew up in the floating villages. They're very picturesque villages that you find in Cambodia. They're actually a tourist attraction. A lot of tourists go there from Siem Reap or other areas, but little do they know that a lot of the populations in these communities do not have a legal identity. Under Cambodian law, probably Jung Hyun has access to Cambodian nationality because his mother was has Cambodian nationality, but because of his Vietnamese name, like the authorities simply don't believe that he can have access to these to nationality. So I've started working with Jung Hyun in the community. When you try to trace Jung Hyun's story, like into the history and the story of his community, there's different Vietnamese communities in Cambodia, so they're migrated at different points in time. My talk is really just about the long-term, what I would call the long-term resident Vietnamese minority population that probably arrived in the 19th century to Cambodia during or before just the French protectorate times. So in the early days, like when Jung Hyun grew up and his family, most people in the communities did not have any legal documentation. The only contact that they have with the state was an annual kind of foreigner tax that they had to pay. It was called the Lankan, and that is basically just a taxation of foreign populations in Cambodia. There was no state presence, there were no services provided, so everyone was just happy with the state as was. Like it was annoying to pay the tax, but otherwise state was not present. And that was true with most of the Cambodian population around Jung Hyun's community as well. Most Cambodians at the time didn't have any identification documents. So this has gradually changed over the course of the history. If you go nowadays in the communities, you find like outreach materials like this hanging around. There's a whole plan, like different identification documents that are nowadays required. And we have heard this in our different presentations throughout the course of the conference as well, how there's an increasingly spread of various forms of documentation that come along with a massive drive of registering populations. Initially, this only took place in Western countries and developed societies. Nowadays, you find this across the globe. And proof of legal identity becomes increasingly important. So even though Jung Hyun, like in his youth and probably like earlier years, has never worried about getting such document, he's clearly aware that he needs now these documents. He sometimes doesn't know what it is, so he refers to the documents always by colors. So there's the yellow document, there's the white document, etc. But he knows that he wants to have those because he needs it to either buy a motorbike, to register a SIM card. Most worryingly, his children, when they do not have a birth certificate, are not able to access school. So a lot of children in the community are not going to school. There's like a makeshift school for children. So there's a big worry in these communities nowadays around those documentations. And as I said, schooling was really like how I initially encountered Jung Hyun's communities and their problems. So nowadays, we have heard in some of these discussions during the legal identity panel, there is now a drive to even further like the already existing 10, 12 different ID documents that exist in Cambodia, to integrate this in a more coherent drive of registering populations. So Cambodia has now a strategy to build up an integrated ID and civil registration system. At the moment, this is just on paper, hasn't been funded. Like there was a consultant was hired, as it is often. A strategy was drafted, but it is not yet underpinned by any funding. So this is a bit the context. What happens at the same time, while the strategy was being released, it was increasingly made clear that Jung Hyun's community will not be part of this universal jurisdiction or universal registration process. So we had in 2014 a census in Cambodia taking place of so-called illegal Vietnamese immigrants, which was a census of almost the entire Vietnamese population in Cambodia. And that was accompanied a few years later by a systematic confiscation of all the documents that this population held. Like in Jung Hoon's community, officials would enter the village and basically confiscate all documents with a view to assessing them. Whether those documents will ever be returned is at this stage uncertain. And at the same time, all populations were issued a new immigration card. So it's probably an attempt by the Ministry of Interior to get hold basically of the different Vietnamese populations and control them through a centralized registration process. The problem is obviously that all populations were treated the same. So Vietnamese immigrants that arrived yesterday would receive the same card as Vietnamese populations that have resided in the countries for generations and generations, like Jung Hoon's. And I'd like one of the statements that a minister has issued in response to media inquiries. Well, we don't remove their citizenship, they are Vietnamese, we just take the Cambodian documents. It's quite funny now. Like there were a number of people in Jung Hoon's community who actually had Cambodian ID cards, but because they had Vietnamese names, they were just confiscated. So this is this kind of thing where there's strong popular attitudes that are manifesting also in governmental action, that certain minority populations are not part of the citizenry. And you will hear very often from a lot of actors that Vietnamese should just go to their country, which in this case is Vietnam. So a familiar story that we had heard across the different presentations here. So when I started working with, with Jung Hoon's community, we encountered a number of problems. So there's on the one hand side, when the SDG 16 came in, so that's now talking to the conference, to the panel theme, we are like, there is a bit like this underpinning hope that this will lead to more inclusive societies, because we hope that these populations one day can become, through a legal bond, part of the society. But on the other hand, what we see in Cambodia is, well, the spread of new identification documents and the link of these documents to access and services and opportunities creates for left out communities like Jung Hoon's increasing problems. Previously, he could just get a motorbike, he could just do certain things just by paying little bribes here and there. This is becoming now increasingly difficult. He's required to have documents that he cannot basically show because they are not issued to his community. At the same time, we struggled to bring this experience to the attention of national and international actors, mainly because we couldn't really tell how many there are. Cambodia does not release census data of the ethnic Vietnamese minority population because it's too sensitive. So no one really knows how many there are in Cambodia. And not being able to provide the scale of the problem basically means that you're not really taken seriously. Up to today, Jung Hoon's community is not counted in any global statistics on documentation challenges or statelessness. The other thing is like when you have marginalized populations, you often access them through all kinds of intermediaries. What happens when you are in a country where most of the key intermediaries do not work with these populations because they also agree that these populations shouldn't be in the country and that they all should go to Vietnam? It has been a huge problem in Cambodia where most of the major human rights NGOs have not taken on the topic and have not advocated on behalf of this community. And that leads me then, how do we confront discrimination in a context where there exists a significant popular support for certain policies? This has been a big challenge in Cambodia. We have been working mostly with like small community-based NGOs, but not with any of the major government entities, nor with any of the development partners, because the development partners also all work through Cambodian counterparts. The other thing that emerged is like, okay, how do you frame then the problem? You want to bring it somewhere out, you want to tell, and Jung Hoon was very keen, Christoph, you have to bring this out, you have to tell the people about it. Okay, how do you frame the problem? So we started out with framing it human rights. So there was like, I Belong campaign was launched, so statelessness was a sexy topic, so we went to UNHCR, we talk about statelessness. At the same time, when we go to UNICEF, we talk about birth registration problems. When you go to the IOHR office, you will talk about the discrimination that communities suffer. In development actors, you will talk about schooling problems. So you go around like different actors and they all want to hear like one aspect of the problem, but there is no really coherent approach. Like for us, I always felt like I was, as I said, more doing forum shopping to frame the problem to the specifics of a certain actor's agenda, on the ground level, we see still very little coherence in this approach, because every actor has their agenda, has their framing of an issue. And what we'd like to see here, what we're discussing here around SDG 69, etc., namely that there would be some sort of a coherent response on the ground, we are still very far away from it. At the same time, as I said, while Cambodia is thinking about all these new biometric cards, a new biometric ID card is being rolled out, there's quite little awareness of basically these kind of socio-political contexts, which is namely the untold discrimination that is taking place in the communities. I think it's really important that when people think about these programs, that there is much more a check of what are these socio-political dynamics on the ground. I have the impression that a lot of larger programs at the moment, in terms of like their do no harm analysis, their social impact assessments and all that kind of stuff, take not thoroughly account of these dynamics. So that all to say is that everything that we have been discussing here in terms of the development goals, etc., a lot of these discussions take place at the global level, and there's still a very long way to go down to the country level. And I think what is necessary now is to bring the experience that you will hear also from the other panelists from different countries, the country level experience more into the debates of how to think about these goals and how to bring experience like Jung Hyun's into the discussions at the global level. Thank you.
As I said, are there any points for clarification? Any very specific questions? Great. I will now pass to Diana, who will talk to us about her work in Kenya.
Thank you very much, Megan. So I have had the pain and honor of working with stateless communities and former stateless communities. At least back home in Kenya, the Makonde who were stateless were recognized. So now we term them formally stateless, okay? So a very good thing. So when I was asked to speak about the legacy of statelessness, I was not sure, okay? What would be this legacy that we want to speak about? Statelessness is a mouthful word, okay? You sometimes wonder, who came up with this word? Couldn't it have been simplified? It's very difficult to touch what exactly is statelessness. But back home, we are known for our athletes, okay? Our Kenyan athletes in marathons are champions. But Kenya is also one of the countries with very huge populations of refugees. In the Swahili language, the word for refugees and athletes is very close, okay? It's what, I'll try and pronounce, you might not get it, it's wakimbizi and wakimbiaji. So very, very linked. But, so Kenya is known for its athletes. Our refugee legacy right now is not the best. So I came to the conclusion that this legacy can be a good one or a bad one. So I'll walk us through what I think is the legacy of statelessness. I am not sure what it is right now for Kenya and for Africa, but I will try. Having worked with former stateless communities and current stateless communities and thinking about the SDGs, the SDGs is this very beautiful document that will eliminate all the ills in the world. It will eliminate poverty, inequalities. Countries will be equal within and without. We will include everybody in education. You know, we only focus on SDG 16.9, but the other SDGs are about human beings, and stateless persons are human beings. So having thought about that, I engaged with our SDG processes in 2015 before the Makonde became nationals. At that time, the LGBTI community was also very agitating and speaking out. We need to be recognized. So in Kenya, the push was more by the LGBTI stateless. We were told, please wait, they are under SDG 16.9. After 2016, at the Kenya Human Rights Commission, we had a program on former stateless persons. Why? Because when the Makonde were recognized, the president promised several things. First, I will make sure you get your IDs and certificates of citizenship within 6 weeks. It happened. I will make sure that Makondes are included in the police service. You've never been employed by the Kenyan government. So we will make sure we give you 100 positions in the military, in the prison service, in the National Youth Service, all very laudable. And then he ordered one of the cabinet secretaries, make sure you speak to your counterpart in the land department to make sure these people get land. We were all smiles, you know. It's a whole transitional justice process from aid to reparations, okay? So after they got their IDs, we had a big celebration. Yeah, we have IDs, now let's move to land. We got to land and went to the local officials, and they asked, these people have gotten IDs. Now you're asking for land. Locals don't have land here. Why would we give stateless people or former stateless people land? Okay? That's when we realized everything that had been promised won't be as easy. So that was the local government at the local level. So later we decided, let's engage the relevant ministry for inclusion in Kenya. It's called the Ministry of Public Service, Youth and Gender Affairs. The cabinet secretary is very well read. She led reforms in the public service. So we told her, Madam, these were the pledges by the president. We need to have an elaborate plan of how to include Makonde, who are now former stateless persons. And she was lost. Include them wasn't their issues were resolved. Okay? So we can't do policies for former stateless persons. But you try to work on a write-up, and then we can see what to do about it. We shared the first write-up, but they were completely lost. What's their claim? In Kenya, we have indigenous communities. So the indigenous community, they mainly have a claim to retain their cultural identity and their ancestral land. So what's their claim? So we told them, these people have never had education, they were never included in the health processes. To date, she's never grasped it. Okay? So those are the policy makers that we have dealt with. At the African level, we do have the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights was adopted by leaders in Africa who are seen to be Pan-African, visionaries, and everything. It has nothing on the right to a nationality. There was a clause that had been included by one of the judges who was drafting, but it was done away with. Why? It was too controversial. So let's deal with the problems of defining our boundaries, our offices, then later we can deal with this controversial issue. But as a result of very many complaints to the African Commission around the right to a nationality, stateless persons, and communities, the African Commission initiated a process of drafting a protocol. This protocol comes 50 years after the formation of the African Union. States are more established, they care more about their territories and sovereignties. So now we are attempting to include and resolve issues of nationality 50 years later. What does that mean? It means it's more difficult because Kenya is now very Kenya. Uganda are our neighbors. They are not Africans. They're not Kenyans. The contestations are deeper. Positions are stronger. But this time, they now have to deal with it somehow. They have refugee problems. They didn't have refugee problems when the formation of the OAU was happening. But now they have to try and integrate. So the draft protocol has had its challenges because particularly countries like Kenya and Uganda that have huge refugee problems are uncomfortable with naturalizing those huge populations, okay? West Africa is more agreeable, but countries like ourselves, it's more problematic. But at the same time, the African Union is in the process of, has enacted a policy for the adoption of an African passport. So that's not contested. Why? It's easy for movement, for business. So let's work on an African Union passport. We have questioned, would it be easier to have all stateless people be called African citizen? Then if they are on Kenyan territory, then they're African citizens in Kenya. Then they're like, no, those people are outliers. Let's discuss business first. So that's a huge opportunity to resolve the issues of identity and nationality of the African population that is stateless, but we have chosen development. Development is always easier, and this all means all who matter, okay? Recently, in Kenya, we had and you've had it in several panels, the National Integrated Management Information System. We are moving to digital registration, biometrics, we even included DNA and things like that as part of our identity. When that process was introduced, we questioned, what's the real Kenyan identity? Because say for citizens by registration, your identity is verified through your ancestry. And the government said, but we are including everyone, even foreigners. It's everybody on the territory. But they've anchored that particular process in a law that only recognizes Kenyan citizens who are above 18. So even if they are registering refugees, the law that introduced this mega project of development does not incorporate even refugees. So then we questioned, what would be required to register people? We need a birth certificate, a national ID, a passport, a residence permit. So at that point, you tell them, then all stateless people will be excluded. What did the government do? They just amended the form and added a new tick box, stateless. Okay? On face value, we celebrated. That's an achievement, because finally, stateless people will be registered in some form of a process. But when it came to the actual implementation, then stateless people were required to bring documents. And in their registration, there was always a question of country of origin. Most of the stateless persons in Kenya are like fourth generation migrants. So your grandparents or great-grandparents are the ones who migrated. So what is your country of origin? What link do you have with it? Some of the communities, there's a Shona community that is stateless. It became easier for them to be recognized, but they were registered using just one machine. So that particular machine the system was reworked, and then everything was to fit the Shona. So any other person who is stateless who would come to register there and is not a Shona would not fit. Communities like the Pemba, for them it just became impossible to register them all together. British overseas citizens who live in Kenya, who are mainly from the Asian community, were registered in that particular process. But then most of them were left behind. All these experiences is to show there are very many opportunities to integrate and ultimately involve stateless people in our policy-making processes. But because we are increasingly stuck on first, let's deal with their nationality. And in the course of this conference, I have had many speakers question, why is it that fundamental rights, freedoms, and services are linked to nationality. That linkage means if you're ever in a situation like me where you have former stateless people who had to walk for kilometers to get nationality, you have to exert the same energy to get them right to education. If they had acquired education, the nationality would just have been an add-on. But for now, every single step has to get to that level. So for me, the legacy of statelessness is, can we ensure they are in as many processes as possible? Can we ensure we are not only engaging the UNHCR, the UNDP, UNFPA, everybody is seized of the issue of statelessness. In our own communities and government, every single ministry that deals with human beings has a place in dealing with the issue of statelessness. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Diana. Once again, before moving on, are there any points for clarification that we can alleviate now? I see none. Excellent. Amanda, you're up next.
Thank you. Just make sure that works. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Diana, thank you for this perfect segue into my presentation. Today I'm going to talk to you about the linkages between statelessness, and I'm actually going to think through the prospect of legal identity as it links to statelessness, and the development goal of education for all. And what does it mean in a place that is ostensibly a best practice? So I'm gonna operate initially on the premise that Thailand is there we go. That Thailand is a place of best practice on two fronts. One, on statelessness resolution, and second, on education for all. So with respect to thinking about Thailand as best practice with statelessness resolution, I'm just going to show you some data from a survey that I'll explain in a bit. But this is a survey that was completed in 2010. So almost 10 years ago. But you can see that in 1965, in the uplands of northern Thailand, I showed you the picture of the mountains, you have a very diverse community of ethnic minorities, many of whom have relatives in neighboring Kachin State, Shan State, Karen State in Burma, Cambodia, et cetera. So this survey is specifically speaking to Highland people in northern Thailand. And in 1965, very few people who were eligible for citizenship in Thailand at the time, less than 1%, were recognized as citizens. And I'm going to use the term recognized as citizens because this is only a subset of the sample of people who met the criteria for citizenship at that time. By 2000, let's see here, maybe this will just be easier. By 2000, Highland people had mobilized themselves to call for the government to recognize their rights to citizenship and to land. So this kind of critical question about land rights is something that we don't really speak about in statelessness conferences, but it's a critical component of many people's calls for recognition of their rights. So by 2000, the conditions of statelessness had changed from one that Jim Scott had called a kind of condition of freedom, right? By the time it was the end of the millennium, conditions of statelessness were those of you couldn't leave a village, you couldn't go to school, you couldn't, even though many villages had schools, you couldn't access universal health care, and you couldn't own any land. So Highland people mobilized and occupied the lawn of the governor in Chiang Mai, which is the largest city in northern Thailand, and called for recognition of their rights to citizenship. And even though it looks like the rate of resolution from 2000 to 2005 is quite small, the population is growing. And in fact, it's the most rapid resolution to citizenship from 2000 to 2005. And in 2005, we also see Thailand has removed an education policy that required children to possess a birth certificate before they go to school. So in fact, by 2005, Thailand had this grand victory and celebrated at the international stage that they would support education for all. So at some level, right, we have protection of rights to education and a kind of dramatic shift in the government's policy to start to resolve citizenship at a broader scale for Highlanders in northern Thailand. This all looks very good. And indeed, in many ways, it is very good. This is just to show you that, indeed, we're seeing, after 2005, what we are seeing is greater access to education among Highlanders. And they're not only just going to school, in terms of entering school, they're actually attaining higher levels of education. So then this question remains. If indeed Thailand is protecting the rights of all children to go to school regardless of their legal status, is there any impact? There should not be any impact with respect to a child's legal status and their ability to go to school. And it's very, very difficult. There are few statistical presentations at a statelessness conference because it's so difficult to acquire large-scale survey data on stateless people, because it often conducting surveys of stateless people either, one, mirrors civil registration practices, and people misunderstand surveys as a kind of civil registration procedure, right? Or also, as we're seeing in the United States, questions about including measures of citizenship on a large-scale survey can expose people to risk if they convey their actual legal status. Or people just won't answer, right? So having conducted a survey that does this, which I'll explain a bit more, we can answer this question. So how does legal status affect access to education here? And I'm going to start with the findings, because if I don't have time to finish everything in the presentation, at least you'll know this. So, despite the fact that Thailand recognizes the right of every child to go to school, regardless of legal status, we can detect that statistically significant inequalities still exist along the lines of citizenship. And what I'm going to convey to you as well is that because Thailand recognizes citizenship, will confer citizenship to individuals whose documentation status is precarious, right? They may not have a very clear claim to citizenship with respect to the documents they possess. Thailand's pathway to citizenship requires people attain a certain level of education in order to have their citizenship recognized. The pathway to citizenship that requires a level of educational attainment is not specific to Thailand. This exists in the United States, and it's growing in other countries as well. But because we see significant inequalities with respect to access to education along the lines of citizenship, we're now also starting to see that the requirements that people attain a certain level of education to get their citizenship conferred means that there is this cycle of exclusion, of structural inequalities that is emerging in Thailand. There we go. Okay, how do we know this? So this is research that we started 15 years ago, and it began mostly with ethnographic research to find out how do people experience statelessness, what was happening in terms of this rapid resolution to statelessness, were the attitudes of the government officials changing? From 2000, sorry, I don't know why this is, it wants to go backwards. Would you, yeah, I'll just let you do it. So go back one. Okay. As many of you know, and as you work in your context, right, stateless people are disproportionately minoritized communities. They're people who are ethno-linguistic minorities. And so it's imperative that when you design a survey on statelessness, that you test that survey in as many languages as possible so that people understand the questions equitably. We did this study in 42 languages. So we had to pilot test the study, which took a year. Conducted this study in 292 villages at the Thai-Burma border for political reasons, which I'm happy to answer questions about. This survey included nearly 300 villages. All of them directly, their fields at least, are located at the Thai-Burma border. This total survey sample was 71,000 people and 15,000 households. And we also conducted surveys of every school that existed in a village, so to understand What is the history of that school? It's very telling that schools at the border in Thailand were founded by the Border Police Patrol, not the Ministry of Education. So the role of education in these communities, the history of the role of education has been one of civilizing people and of trying to convey to people that this is the border of Thailand, right? So schools do a kind of civilizing purpose and a symbolic purpose they perform a symbolic purpose of showing people where the border is. So we did a survey of the schools as well and everyone who teaches in the school. Then it took 8 months to do the survey. I just will show you quickly. We trained 1,000 survey researchers, and this is a picture. Many of the villages that we had to get to are easier to access through Myanmar. So we had to cross over the river in order to come back into a village that's located on the side of the river. So it took about 6 to 8 months in terms of back and forth data collection. And that is a shout out to my team of people who were doing survey kind of quality control. Then it took almost 2 years to enter data. Now it can be much faster. The problem, of course, is that many of these communities don't have written orthography, or there's no settled idea about what the written orthography should be. In each country, a different group uses a different writing system. So while you can do surveys on iPads in many parts of the world and you could enter data very quickly, in this particular space it took 2 years because you had to do it on paper. So that's what that looks like. And now, after doing a round of analysis, I've been going back to Thailand and just got done doing some focus groups and looking at to what extent do survey findings from almost 10 years ago, what do they mean now? The short answer to this question is that very little has changed, even though we do see approximately 20 to 30,000 people every year get citizenship, most notably if you've heard the case of the children who were stuck in the cave, right? 3 of them were stateless, and there was a big celebration at the government level about conferring nationality to them after they survived 18 days in a cave. So there's a lot of pomp and circumstance and a lot of PR campaigns by the state to say, we did this, we're conferring citizenship. They should have had citizenship before they got stuck in the cave, to be clear. Okay. So now, I issued this finding initially to say that there are significant inequalities with respect to one's legal status and access to education. And I'm not going to get into the modeling strategy, but if there are any data wonks in the room, refer to the left. What I'm going to do here is compare 2 groups initially. So the first group is the control group, and these are children, this child here in the green circle. This is a school bus leaving one of the villages to get to a nearby school. So for purpose of illustration, you have a child on the right, and both of her parents are Thai citizens, measured by possession of a Thai ID card. And then you have the child, I'm sorry, this is my right. Then you have the child on the right in the red who has 2 parents without citizenship. And as far as I can tell, the parents meet the criteria for possession of legal identity and not citizenship. So the slippage between statelessness and legal identity is something that we have to think about with respect to constructing measures of what does legal identity mean. So what are their educational trajectories? The answer to this is that not only does the child of 2 parents have significantly lower educational opportunities than the same child in the same village whose parents have citizenship. But those inequalities exist at elementary school. And this controls for whether the school is in the village. It controls for the ethnicity of the child. It controls for all range of factors that should not matter with respect to access to education. Thank you. The second category of people that's also interesting because this situation is changing. And there are so many children who have one parent who's a citizen and one parent who does not have citizenship. What is the educational trajectory of that child compared to those who have citizenship? And again, the educational trajectories of a child whose one parent has citizenship is much closer to a child whose parents do not have citizenship at all. There are indirect reasons for why these inequalities are persisting, which I'm happy to talk about, and these answers come from the ethnography. They do not come from statistical analysis. But this is to show, right, none of this should matter. There should be no statistical inequities perceptible if they are extreme. Controlling for villages, and not even, remember, the survey is only at the border villages. We're not comparing children in the highlands to children in Bangkok. So what we're seeing, right, is, again, because the path to citizenship in Thailand is linked to one's educational attainment. If you read the fine print on every new ostensibly progressive and widely celebrated citizenship and nationality law that's being revised, if you read the fine print, it says those who do not have birth registration, those whose parents are not citizens or born on the territory, must complete a bachelor's degree. The likelihood that either one of those children who have a parent without citizenship will complete a bachelor's degree is almost zero. So, what looks like this widely celebrated campaign, Education for All, it is true that the state has made much more progressive moves to reduce barriers to citizenship, and we do see that every year about 20,000 people are getting their citizenship conferred. We are building into this a new structure of inequality between education and citizenship that we need to attend to when we think about the kind of development agendas. So I'll conclude really quickly about what does this mean, what are the implications? You can go ahead. So the first claim I'm going to make may be a little bit provocative, but I think what this suggests, right, because we're measuring citizenship and legal status by virtue of who the parents are and what their status is. And I would suggest that when we think about children's rights, and we're thinking about the child's right to education and what is our advocacy angle with respect to thinking about rights to citizenship, to do this effectively, you have to advocate for children's parents. Children's parents are the ones who are able to provide the means to go to school in the first place, right? You cannot just think about legal status with respect to a single individual child. They exist within communities, within families, and you have to advocate for the parents as well. And then, again, we need more evidence-based policy, and I'm actually going to make the case that you don't need to survey 70,000 people to know how things work. I can talk about why we had to do this in this particular case. You can actually really do very robust, smaller-scale studies that can detect these levels of inequality as well as access to education and citizenship in very effective ways. So I'm happy to talk about any of that with any of you. I appreciate your attention and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Amanda. Once again, you know what I'm going to ask. Any points for clarification, briefly? No, great. Okay, I'd also like to commend the first three speakers on your timely presentations. It was very punctual. I will now invite Rahana to the podium to present her work on the formerly stateless upcountry Tamils. Excuse me.
Thank you. Oops, sorry about that. Thank you, Megan, and thank you also to the previous speakers, whom I think I see a lot of parallels between the three stories we've heard and Sri Lanka's case. Which is of a formerly stateless population. So I will speak about the upcountry Tamils in Sri Lanka. The upcountry Tamils, for a bit of context. I hope you can all see me. I can't actually see all of you. So I'm just going to move over here. I can see a bit more of you. Yes, the upcountry Tamils in Sri Lanka actually first came to Ceylon at the time to work on the British colonial tea plantations. And so I think this story illustrates a lot of things that we already know and understand about statelessness, right? And there are three main kind of points that I want to make. Like, first is that statelessness is usually preceded by a longer history of discrimination. Statelessness is not the beginning of discrimination. It's almost midway or a culmination of a longer campaign of inequality, marginalization, and discrimination that these communities face. So that means that the stateless population is already vulnerable in many respects. And then statelessness then compounds these vulnerabilities and usually worsens them and sustains them over time. The second thing is, so once you have a population that is stateless, there's often a campaign then to address that gap, to restore their citizenship. because statelessness implies a lack of something, right? It's a lack of a nationality. And there's a whole reorientation of development agenda that goes towards restoring that nationality. But nationality is often not, I mean, we assume that it's a path to many of these things, to education, to civil rights, to healthcare, but a right to a nationality that is granted through legal reform to give citizenship does not always address the structural barriers and impediments that these communities have faced for so long. So then the legal reform is often wholly inadequate when it comes to ensuring things like a right to education, a right to healthcare. And what that shows in our case, what we found in the Hill County Tamils then is that members of this formerly stateless community just did not identify their citizenship as having delivered all of these goods that they anticipated. So they don't see it as having meaningfully transformed their status in any way. And so the purpose of our study was actually to try to understand what is it about their experience that has meant that giving them a legal status of citizenship did not translate into all of these goods that we associate with citizenship. And so the story of the Hill County Tamils illustrates a lot of these structural barriers to development in a very real sense. And they're quite similar to Kenya's case about the right to education, to Thailand's, to Cambodia's. And so what I'll talk about is actually what factors specifically that we were able to identify in the case of this community as those structural barriers. Because often it seems like a very abstract idea, right? There's some historical discrimination, a legal status of citizenship does not address them. What we try to do was figure out what exactly are those barriers. So first I'll give you all just a bit of context. So this community, like I said, came to work on the plantations. They were denied citizenship at the point at which Sri Lanka became independent in 1948. There were successive rounds of legal reform through the 1960s, the 70s, and the 80s that granted citizenship to this community in waves. And finally, in 2003, there was a final legal solution that declared that anyone who was of this community is now a citizen. So Sri Lanka's Hill County Tamils have been a formerly stateless population for many, many years. But despite being citizens, they actually still are among the most marginalized and vulnerable communities in the country. So in the terminology of the SDGs, they are what we call the furthest behind. So what we tried to do then was, why does this continued disadvantage exist? So we did a study that we worked quite closely with Amal from ISI. It involved extensive sort of field research, literature reviews. And I'll just talk a bit about the conclusions of it, which were that we identified 3 key sort of drivers of this disadvantage that have persisted despite the grant of legal citizenship. And the first is what I call the distancing of the state. And this is true of many stateless populations, right? So when a community is stateless, they become invisible to the state. And in this case, there's a distancing in that there's also an acute discrimination that this community faces. There's also just a complete sort of withdrawal of the state from this community while it's expanding elsewhere, right? So one example actually is of roads, for instance. Now this community, because they are a plantation labor force, actually live on plantations. And a plantation is a private commercial property, which has been understood to mean that the state cannot deliver public services into this private land. So the state does not build roads. It does not provide sanitation. It doesn't provide education, healthcare, local government services, documentation. And one example that came about in our field research was actually with relation to posts. I'll come to that later. So one is there's a general pattern of discrimination in the Sri Lankan state, which is that it is a majoritarian state. So there is a generalized discrimination against minorities, and this manifests when anyone from minority tries to deal with the government. But the case of the Hill County Tamils is acute in that there is also this retreat of the state. And the example of posts that I will talk about is, can we switch. Do you know how normal like postal service works, right? Everyone has an address. There is a state-run postal service that delivers letters to your address. If you live on an estate, you don't have an address. The only address is that of the factory, the tea factory, right? And there's thousands of people who live in what we call blind rooms on the estate. None of them have an address. And there is no postal service. So what happens then is that the plantation company assume some of these functions that are otherwise delivered by the state. And this is quite unusual on the tea estates, right? Because there's this strange sort of blurring of the boundary between what a state should provide and what the plantation company provides. And you'll find that it eventually became, it was the company that actually provided schools. The company ran healthcare. They had estate sort of medical officers. They provided childcare. All of these things that the state provides elsewhere on the plantations were provided by the company. So example of postal service is also one of them. Here we have a story by Geeta, who was one of the members of the community we met during our field research, and she explains that, so, you know, when she gets a letter to go to university, an acceptance letter, it never comes to her. And she actually misses an opportunity to go to university because the letter gets stuck at the estate, at the tea factory. The tea factory doesn't actually deliver the letters, it just sits with them. And that shows how where the state has retreated and allowed the company to take over these functions, and the company obviously like fails in that respect. So the first driver then is that retreat of the state. And in the case of the Hill Country Tamils, this is related to dependency on the plantation company. So the company, like I said, then comes to assume a lot of these state-like functions. They fulfill a lot of these everyday needs. They build schools, they build hospitals, they provide sort of primary sort of medical, like medicines for these people. And the unusual sort of characteristic that this leads to is that, so the company has been described as almost a governmental like service provider, right? But the thing is, if it's a plantation company, they offer these benefits as part of the employment bargain. It's not a service in the same way that you do from a democratically elected government. And what that does is it sustains unequal bargaining power between the worker and the employer. Because not only are they your employer, they are also your sort of quasi-government, your quasi-service provider in many respects. And the company often sees this as like there's a saying that a lot of companies will say that, oh, you know, we actually take care of our workers from womb to tomb, meaning they carry out like all of these things that, you know, ordinary workers do not get because, hey, when they work for us, we give them all of this. And that's often used as a way of, I think, justifying this kind of dependency that the company creates. But actually what it does, it entrenches this dependency and also reinforces the retreat of the state, right? Because the state no longer needs to be fulfilling all of these things. And what that also then contributes to is what we identified as a third factor, the third driver of this structural disadvantage, which is what I call brokerage by trade unions. So in Sri Lanka, like many other sort of South Asian countries, trade unions are also political parties. And the plantation trade unions in Sri Lanka are sort of concentrated around this block that use it as a vote base. And the plantation trade union plays an unusual role in that not only are they the community sort of elected representatives, they're also your everyday like fixers. If you have a problem with your Kangani, who is the person who is your labor overseer, you go to the union guy. If you have a problem with your neighbor, you go to the union guy. If you have a dispute with the plantation company over your wages, you go to the union guy. And so the unions have sort of entrenched themselves as this institution in the plantation that the community is forced to rely on to do everyday dispute solving. So when we spoke to interviewees, a lot of them explained that so this community oddly has the highest levels of political representation because they are all members of a union. But the reason they're all members of a union is because you can't survive if you aren't a member of a union. you need your union guy to resolve problems that crop up in your everyday life, right? So they explain that you can actually, on a plantation, you get a little card at the beginning of the year, and you get a union fee that's cut from your pay, your sort of daily pay every day. And on that card, you can specify, okay, this is my union for the next 6 months. Right? At the end of the 6 months, you can change your union. Say, actually, no, I want to be in this guy's union. And the reason people have this sort of instrumental mode of political participation is because that political representation is about solving everyday problems. It's not about addressing the sort of higher sort of civil and political rights that people usually aspire from their political parties. So those are the three sort of structural drivers of disadvantage that we identified. So there's the distancing of the state, there's a dependency on the plantation company, and there's a brokerage of the plantation unions, right? And what this revealed in the context of statelessness is that, so there's a lot of activity that is around granting this community nationality, right? But as long as these sort of structural impediments remained in place, there was very little that a nationality could do to overcome the actual barriers to development that the community faces. And it became clear then why citizenship meant so little to this community, because it did not actually transform the barriers that they faced in their everyday lives. So I'll conclude by saying that what Sri Lanka's case revealed then, like many of the others, is that overcoming that legacy of statelessness actually involves addressing the structural constraints to development. Because right to nationality on its own does not actually guarantee, if it doesn't guarantee these other rights to education, to healthcare, to political representation, then you can't actually move these communities from legal status of citizenship to citizenship that is meaningful to their lives. I'll stop with that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Rana. Points for clarification, briefly. I see none. All right. We will now move to our final presentation. And again, this is an interesting one because it's a bit of a counterpoint. And in the way that Rahana was also explaining, there are different structures other than the state through which people can access rights, but those structures themselves might also create dependency. There's other forms of accessing rights and modernization and development. So we'd like to invite Professor Chatty to the table.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me here to speak today and to give me an opportunity to take another perspective. Megan started by referring to James Scott's work, The Seeing Like a State. I'm going to refer you to his later work, The Art of Not Being Governed, because I think that's basically the message that there are a lot of other ways of managing your community, your society's well-being than depending upon the state. I'm going to give you first a very brief historical background to the community that I'm talking about. These are the Bedouin of the Middle East, or those people who live in the desert, as another term, or mobile peoples, or herding societies. So all of these terms I'm just going to shorthand as Bedouin, which is a term that comes directly from Arabic, referring to people who live in the Badia, the semi-arid desert lands of the region. And what I'm going to try and show you is that amongst these communities, the nature of belonging and the deliberate marginalization among Bedouin herding tribes and also by them in the Middle East is very important in order to understand the different forms of development. I'll put that in brackets here related to these people. First, I'll use the case study in Lebanon, and then later on the case study in Oman. These are communities I've worked with, I think, since I think before many of you were born. I first started working with Bedouin 47 years ago. So, and I continue to visit the Bedouin both in Lebanon, unfortunately not in Syria at the present, but also in Oman. So the case study in Lebanon is going to refer to what I've called benign neglect by government policy, accidental or otherwise, and this characterizes the Bedouin interaction with the state in Lebanon. And then when I turn to look at the case in Oman, I've labeled that enlightened authoritarianism in terms of the relationship between these herding communities and the state in the post-1970s modern state of the Sultanate of Oman and also the United Arab Emirates. So, have I got the right one? Sorry. There we go. I don't mean to suggest that the middle of the Arabian Peninsula is empty, but I've only just put up here the tribes that I've worked with in the northern part of Arabia as well as in the south. The whole of the peninsula is full of mobile pastoral peoples. It's not an empty land as oil companies would have you suggest. So what this sketch also shows, which I think is important, is the lack of borders and the lack of frontiers in terms of the lay of the land as perceived by the Bedouin in this region. And these ideas date back, I'm going to say, more than several centuries. We know through Arab historiography, at least since the 12th and 13th century, that many of these communities considered their rights to use the extensive semi-arid lands in this region. Now, the tribes in Arabia have always existed along the margins of settlement. In the Ottoman Empire, they basically controlled movement across the desert, movement across from one city to another. They controlled the Hajj, the caravan to Mecca, and they controlled the important trade routes. Once we come to the 20th century, they also began to control the routes in order to keep the oil pipelines safe, particularly the pipelines to Haifa in the north, but the same also in the south. These tribes were not indigenous. I just want to make that clear. They were autochthonous, which meant they were present at the same time as all other settlements in the region. Many of the tribes were registered amongst the city-states of the Ottoman Empire, so they were recognized as being part of, but rather marginal by choice to government, so they could always move away if they didn't like the policies that were being imposed upon them by the state. Thank you. So just a quick, I must keep to time, the benign neglect in Lebanon. I worked with two tribes that had moved from the Syrian Badia into what they called the finger of the Badia in the Bekaa Valley, basically between Homs, Salamiyah, and Al-Qa, the Lebanese corridor, where these tribes had what they called common use rights to the land. Obviously, during the French Mandate, these rights were gradually eaten away by the French encouragement of private land ownership, and these communities slowly lost their grazing areas. However, effective government control didn't reach these interior parts of the country, and most of the workings of I'm going to call civil society, if you can put it that way, emerged between the tribal leadership and the local mayors or mukhtars in the communities through which they passed. So this benign neglect led to what I call the stateless Bedouin in Lebanon managing their own modernization development without state interference or state support. I should just stop here and say Lebanon, when I first started working there in the 70s, I was always told there are no Bedouin in Lebanon. However, there are about 100,000 Bedouin in Lebanon who have full citizenship and another 100,000 who don't, basically because their grandfathers or great-grandfathers refused to register with the state during the 1932 census in Lebanon, which is the only census the Lebanese government has ever taken. So there are about 100,000 people who have no citizenship, although the Lebanese government always reminds me that actually their citizenship is under study, but it's been under study for about 70 years. And then their offspring are silenced. So their offspring don't even have papers that say that their citizenship is under study. However, despite this, the Bedouin in Lebanon, particularly in the northern Bekaa, have been able to quite independently transform their society. That's one very much depending upon camel for transport, to one depending upon pickup trucks in the 1970s and in the 1980s, recognizing that if they bought tractors and other sort of farming equipment, they would be able to lease this equipment to the local farmers or rent them out along with their labor, which became a very important source of seasonal income for these tribes in the region who, because they had no citizenship, had no access to government health care or to education. But I call it benign neglect because the government didn't mind if they paid privately for health care or paid privately for education, which is how these communities coped. So they were, even being denied citizenship, they found ways of being agents of change and of modernizing their society and livelihoods to meet the opportunities that were around them. So that's the benign neglect that I discuss in. I'm just really giving you a very quick overview, but let me turn to see if I can get these images up here, so I can get that all up here, to the mobile pastoralists or the Bedouin in Southeast Arabia. This is a proper desert. I call it with less than 50 millimeters of rain per year, really very low resources over extensive periods. But in this part of Arabia, again, these people are autochthonous, and they're actually fought over by several states. I just remind you that in the United Arab Emirates, only 10% of the population of the United Arab Emirates are actually Emirati citizens. And in Oman, somewhere between 45 to 50% of the population are actually citizens. The remaining are all basically legal migrant laborers, mainly from Southeast Asia, but also a lot of white migrants from Europe who are not called migrants, but they're called expatriates. So in this part of the world, you have a contestation over what citizenship people should hold. But let me just give you a little bit of an overview of one case study. Maybe can we move this to the next slide? Yes, so I'm just going to very briefly talk about the Harasis, who are in the middle of Oman on the edge of the empty quarter. They control, or they feel that they have control over an area of about 40,000 square kilometers, about the size of Scotland, and it's a population of about 5,000 people, but they basically inhabit the border between Oman and Saudi Arabia. So that is considered extremely important by the Omani government, the idea being that if your citizens are living on a territory, that gives you about 95% proof to claim that territory of your own. So the government is very keen to make sure that these people remain in Oman. However, these goat and camel herders have recognized that they inhabit an important area in terms of oil resource for the Omani government, but they're also being sought after by the Emirati government to become citizens of both of these states and basically to settle. So the term enlightened authoritarianism is this ability by both states to be rather forgiving of these communities that cross both borders to take advantage of what they consider the best education that they can get, which is normally in Oman, or the best health services they can get, which is normally in the United Arab Emirates. So they move back and forth, and if I have a few minutes, I'll move to the next slide, and the next one. Yeah, let's get this one up too. Just an image of these people when I first began to work with them. Obviously, they have a very clear notion of their identity and their belonging to a particular territory in what is Oman, but they move freely between Oman, the United Arab Emirates, and also to Saudi Arabia. The emphasis of both states on settling these communities has been really lessened. Both governments have tried to set up social housing for them, which are basically narrow townhouses, and trying to find ways of bringing them to accept government services and to maintain passports of each country, but their sense of identity and their belonging obviously doesn't change as they have this ability to kind of choose which state they will spend their time in. So this is some of the low-cost housing that's been built for them, but many of these communities have rejected the low-cost housing, or I should say they've they've put their animals into the low-cost housing, and then later on they've rented out these housing units to oil company employees, and then eventually recognized that some of the schools that were set up in these communities, it was worthwhile at least to live in these units during part of the year. But having said that, these communities are very aware of their identity and their sense of belonging to the desert, and so those who've accepted the low-cost housing, if I can move to the next slide, have created mobile, I've called them temporary camps, but these are mobile residences which allow the older generation to pass on their culture, their traditions in the desert to the younger generation, despite having access to government housing in both countries. So the citizenship which accords rights and services in either country, this is where I say you have a sort of an enlightened form of authoritarianism. At least both countries, if not all three countries, are trying to remain as relaxed as possible, knowing that these communities are moving back and forth very opportunistically to take advantages of the best of the services that these governments can provide. So just my last slide. Do I have a minute or two? Let me just put up second, third. Okay, so just to sum up a little bit, I think in terms of development and mobile herding or Bedouin, the legacy, most of the Bedouin in Arabian Peninsula have increased their mobility through vehicular traffic, etc., basically across state lines. These communities don't need to cross at a border point. They still manage to go back and forth, and if they are unhappy with the way they're treated in one country, they will move to another. But in order to maintain their identity and sense of belonging in the desert and still take advantage of the settlement opportunities of these countries, many have now set up what they call temporary camps in order to reinculcate, reculturate their young children who are in state schools in the desert environment. So just to sum up, you have obviously in Lebanon the state not interested in these communities or recognizing that they're there, but as long as they pay their way, that's fine. And in Oman and in the United Arab Emirates, this kind of enlightened authoritarianism, which has at times resulted in what I'm going to call international squabbles between the two countries, with Oman, for example, sending its foreign minister to the United Arab Emirates to insist on its people being returned, that they've been kidnapped, and the response being, well, they can leave if they want to. But again, whatever citizenship they might take, it doesn't actually change their sense of identity, nor the way in which the community functions and opportunistically tries to develop in order to meet the demands of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chatty. All right, is there a point for clarification?
Very quickly.
Okay, go right ahead, please.
No, just to mention very quickly, ask very quickly, is there an of course, very useful. Thank you. Is there an element of sectarianism in the Omani case? I've got two questions. Is that a factor in their situation? At the beginning, also, this is the second question. You talked about enlightened authoritarianism, but at the end, you referred to international squabbles. So, enlightened authoritarianism suggests that they benefit, at least to my mind, that they are the beneficiaries of this sort of thing. So, has their identity, their status, been weaponized by either Oman or the UAE? So those two quick questions.
Yes, in terms of sectarianism, that probably is relevant in Oman. The Bedouin who hold the document that's called Qaid al-Dars, under study, the Walid, Kamal Jumblat and then Walid Jumblat fought very hard for them to be recognized as Lebanese. It was meant to be granted around the turn of the century, 21st century, but it was blocked by the Maronite bloc in parliament because, of course, Bedouin are almost across the board Sunni Muslim. There are a few Shia Muslim that were proselytized by some of the Iranian preachers in Syria, beginning in the late 1980s, etc. But by and large, Bedouin in Arabia are Sunni Muslim. So the enlightened authoritarianism is what I'm calling the sort of relaxed attitude of both states in order to try to entice the Bedouin to remain or to take out, to hold on to the passports of each country. I mean, there was a time when both states knew that pastoralists in the Harasis, for example, had Omani papers and they had Emirati papers. And that enlightened kind of position was sort of, okay, no other GCC citizen or national is allowed to hold more than one passport. But they were kind of allowed to until after the death of Sheikh Zayed, when the Emirati government said, okay, you've got to choose. You hold one passport and another. So many chose the Emirati passport, but basically keep their herds and their mobile, what I'm called units, where they spend their weekends and about 3 months of the year in Oman. So it hasn't changed their sense of belonging, but the squabble has been the Omani government is really very concerned about not having a population on its border with Saudi Arabia, because that's the border that they're quite concerned with. You know, over the decades, over the centuries, Saudi incursions into Oman have been quite common. So obviously there is some smuggling that takes place from the Emirates all the way across to Yemen. And of course, by controlling this population, they can control that movement. But I'm not sure. I know some of the smuggling is drugs, some of it is camels. There may be some weapons, but it's really quite limited.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we are now going to move to a little bit of the discussion, question, and answer session. We only have about 10 minutes, so I will implore you to please keep your questions focused and specific. But also, we'd invite questions that the entirety of the panel might respond to. So if you have a very specific question for one of the panelists, I invite you to maybe pose that question after the session, and let's keep the entire panel included. So I believe I saw this gentleman first, and then Melanie after that. And please introduce yourself as you pose your question.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jawad Firouz from Salam for Democracy and Human Rights. I believe there are three main elements should be imposed somehow on the states that we can get the solution to the crisis in the different parts of the world that you mentioned. First of all, to maintain the sustainable development, I believe that it should be, there is a continuous political reforms. With that we can guarantee that the required by all different powers, and part of it definitely different NGOs and different influential people, that they can be modified within the government system. The third one, it should be based on the human rights. So in the absence of human rights in this political process or in the structure of the government, we will see such abuses and continuing on. So the question is how we can frame it within certain type of convention or so on with the United Nations that they can impose in the government. My second question, it's related to the basic services of the state toward whoever living in their lands, regardless if they are citizen or not. So the citizenship, I mean the services for the education and health mainly, shouldn't be related to the citizenship at all. So we cannot deprive this basic service of the state to anyone conditional to that they should have a citizenship. How we can push it as a joint effort that could be imposed on all these states. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Just to summarize them briefly, looking at this problem in terms of a human rights framework, does that provide new answers, avenues for solutions? And secondly, how do we push to decouple services and public goods from citizenship? I'm going to take another question and allow the panelists to kind of reflect very briefly. Melanie, I believe you raised your hand, please. And there's a mic coming towards you.
Thank you, Melanie Khanna from UNHCR. Thank you to all the panelists for really great, rich presentations. It's interesting to me that 4 out of the 5 sort of highlighted grand challenges that those of us who work on statelessness are familiar with, but you made it, very again, rich in terms of, angles that we may not, be aware of in particular countries, or issues that we may not be so aware of in particular countries. And then one out of the five of you is sort of, totally breaking the mold and, shaking up the conversation, which I really appreciate. I have to admit that when I came to this panel, I wasn't sure what the development legacy of statelessness was meant to refer to, and I'm still not sure what the development legacy of statelessness is meant to refer to. I kind of assumed that there would be more explicit discussion and reflection on the colonial legacy of statelessness. It was implicit in the discussion of people coming to work on tea plantations during the colonial era in Ceylon. But I just wondered, opening it up for the panel, does anybody want to reflect on the colonial legacy of statelessness in your particular country setting context?
Okay, very good. I will take one final question for this round and then move to the panelists to answer as they see fit. So the lady behind Melanie, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. The presentation was very interesting. My name is Elaine, and I'm from a local organization in Pakistan called Faces Pakistan. And we've been working with Afghan refugees since the last 10 years. With the last presentation, I see a lot of similarities among the Bedouins and also the situation of the Afghan refugees in Pakistan, because it's this is now a third generation of Afghan refugees that are living in Pakistan and are being denied citizenship rights categorically. And of course, you must already be aware of other facts where they're denied education in public schools, they're denied livelihood opportunities, etc., etc. The other problem is that there is a systematic political non-will to deal with the Afghan refugee case over the last many years. The UNHCR also seems to be very politicized and under a lot of political pressure because of the nexus of the United States, India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. So all of this put together being very political. My question, or rather my problem, is with this kind of political unwill where NGOs are also being stopped from working with Afghan refugees for any kind of rights acquisitions. Also the UNHCR being so highly politicized. What kind of other international pressures or mechanisms or tools could organizations like us utilize within the country to take forward this case of citizenship rights for the third generation of Afghan refugees in Pakistan?
Great, thank you very much. So that's quite a bundle of issues. We're exploring the human rights framework, decoupling citizenship from rights acquisition or public goods, the legacy of post-colonialism, and finally the politicization of refugee status and how new ways of addressing that impediment, suggestions you might have. So do I have anyone who wants to volunteer? Amanda, go right ahead. There's one. Oh, yeah. It works.
Is it on? Is this on? Okay. I'll be very quick. I initially started my talk to basically take apart this concept of development, and I thought actually maybe what we should do is take it as if we all believe in it, which in fact I pose serious questions about the project in general. But I will say that the people that I work with believe in it deeply. I do not know, and this is, Jim Scott begins his book begins in Southeast Asia with people who reject the state. And there is not a single person that I have met in doing 15 years of ongoing work in the Highlands that people don't want citizenship. And I would just invert it with respect to the question about the colonial legacy of statelessness. In truth, citizenship is the colonial legacy. And the way people think about themselves now in terms of who they are. So in fact, in contradistinction to Dr. Chatty's work, the hegemonic notion of citizenship is completely infiltrating and reorganizing the relationships to themselves and one another. And the quickest example of that is that Aka people can recite their genealogies 2,000 years back, 52 generations. And this is by means of if you are Aka and you move to this village and you recite your genealogy, someone over here, if you connect 7 generations, this instigates a range of cultural and actual material obligations very similar to citizenship. And they call that now their Aka passport. This is the way in which they claim belonging in villages. It is transforming their entire relationship to themselves and one another. So if it is not clear from the presentation, the colonial legacies are absolutely present in every part of this project in Thailand. But the problem or issue in the normative project of issuing citizenship is that everybody knows this in the Highlands. They're totally aware that by acquiring citizenship, they're giving up something. But the situation is so dire for people who don't have it because we have made it so. We have generated a political economy in which documents are the only way to get recognition. Mm-hmm. And the more that we demand that through DNA testing and other kinds of biometric identification, the worse it will get. So that's the summary here. I don't know who wants
who would like to follow up that rather dark outlook?
I'd just like to add to that and maybe, so I spoke a bit about the fact that in Africa we want to resolve the issues of nationality now, 50 years after most of the African states attained their independence, okay? That will be more problematic. Why? Because of the colonial legacy. And back home in Kenya, on my slides I had something like that. I realized I didn't operate this. We had, in 2010, we got a new constitution. We have an entire citizenship chapter. We defined a few things. But when it came to the flesh of how to define Kenyan identity and citizenship, we went back to 1963 and the laws that we inherited from our colonial masters. So all these issues of migration, how we defined ourselves, are very much linked. I'm not sure how we will shed off that. And it might be linked to what he's asked, his opinion. Political reforms continuously, a sense of state reconstruction, okay? Move away from everything that we have been taught and redefine ourselves as a way of ensuring we include everybody, do away with statelessness, and maybe also eliminate other forms of marginalization in that sense. And the second issue that has been raised on human rights, I agree 100%. If you were to go to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, go bit by bit, don't even go to the right to a nationality. If we worked on other aspects and included literally everybody, you know, oftentimes we say the best government are government for the people, by the people. But which people? That remains the most critical question. Does democracy work? This idea of majority, will they ever think about minorities who, and most stateless people fall in the minority category? Is that something that we need to challenge now to get forward on issues of statelessness? Because throughout this conference, I am not sure, even the largest crisis in Rohingya, where the numbers are higher, yet they are the minorities, that will ever sail through a popular process. Most of the time, statelessness has been addressed by regional human rights mechanisms that care about minority, international mechanisms, strategic litigation, and things like that. So I do agree a human rights-based approach would surely be very, very monumental in addressing statelessness.
Excellent. Thank you. So we're hearing a lot of doubt about whether the frameworks and structures under which we currently operate, and oftentimes in which we put quite a lot of faith, ideas of democracy, ideas of state coordination, might very well be the exact structures that are inhibiting our ability to find solutions. Yes, Don, Professor Trouting.
Well, this actually opens up, I think, a Pandora's box. If we can talk about neocolonialism in the Arabian Peninsula, certainly under the British and French mandate, and well, I'll just let me go to even 1970. You've got the difficulty of, for example, British advisors insisting that all land in the country should become state land. So this is the case in the United Arab Emirates, in Oman, et cetera, which meant that therefore the oil companies, because oil extraction is so important, then considered this land as government land, and therefore it's empty. So it's terra nullius. So it's really a matter of recognition as human beings, not even talking about citizenship, that becomes the issue in this part of the world. And this is, I think, a huge issue in terms of all of these multinationals. For those people who inhabit the deserts, as far as they're concerned, government is the oil company. It's not the state. Because this is where they have their continuous confrontation over their right to be here, and with the engineers, both European and others, insisting that they've only come because of the presence of the oil company, et cetera, et cetera. So multinational extraction, whether it's mining in other parts of the world or oil extraction, et cetera, is also a big issue, and I think one which challenges the rights, the belonging, and the identity of many of these people.
Interesting. And also demonstrates some parallels with the work that Rahana was talking about in terms of statelessness also renders people vulnerable to the co-optation, or at least to being made dependent upon other structures of governance and structures that don't provide access to political representation, for example. So another aspect that we really need to be mindful of. Rahana and Christoph, did you have, Rahana, go ahead.
So I want to address two things. I think first is the question on rights. So I think in Sri Lanka's case, and this instances where there is this non-state structures that come to sort of replace the state. And that tells you, that shows you very clearly how you can have things that are associated with development, you have education, healthcare, but not on the basis of rights, right? So in the case of the Hill County Tamils, you get education because there is a law that has compelled a very reluctant company to do so, and they do it to the very sort of minimum extent that they can. This is not a right to education that you can claim. And the inequality of education that has persisted is partly then attributable to the fact that elsewhere in the country there is a right to education, there is a whole entire state machinery around education. Welfare is actually it's almost politically expected of governments, but on a plantation company, it is a bargain as part of your employment. And then so changing that relationship from one that is sort of, employment-based to rights-based actually makes that transformation. The second thing I want to also talk about is a bit this idea of the colonial legacy. And it's true of many countries, there is certainly a colonial legacy, a colonial origin to the kind of conditions that you see today. But I think from the point of view of mobilizing action, right, it requires you to understand structures as they are today. And in Sri Lanka, at least, there's someone who is, like in Sri Lankan civil society and perhaps other countries, there's, I think, a tendency to kind of fixate on this, this idea that there's a colonial origin to this, which is correct sort of analytically, historically, but it can also be, serve as sometimes a distraction from the current structures that are in place that are sort of entrenched in a manner that is independent of the colonial legacy also. So I think it's useful to understand the colonial sort of history, but from point of view of moving action, you ought to understand what it is today.
No, excellent reflection. We are unfortunately very close to being out of time, so I'm going to give Christoph the last word for the moment. If you have burning questions that you did not get to ask, I invite you to come approach our esteemed panelists, and I've just opened you guys all up to a flood of individual inquiries. But Christoph, would you like to have any final words based on the questions that were asked?
Yeah, maybe also two observations from Cambodia on the colonial legacy and maybe the access to services. The whole creation of a Khmer nation state is a colonial legacy, and that the Vietnamese form not part of that nation can perhaps also be traced back to colonial times. The French protectorate already had different jurisdictions for Vietnamese compared to the Khmer. That was mainly because a lot of Vietnamese were brought in also for the colonial administration, where there were therefore tried in different courts and different institutions. And that has perpetuated over the course of post-colonial Cambodia, even though, as you perhaps know, under the current laws, I would say a large parts of the groups could actually be considered Cambodian citizens. It's just not an avenue that's available in practice. If you have immigration cards from Jung Hoon, for instance, the Cambodian authorities even take it upon themselves to write in there that they have Vietnamese nationality. There's a field nationality. The Cambodian authorities write in their Vietnamese. I'm not sure if the Vietnamese authorities in Vietnam actually share this view. In terms of the service provisions, I do not see at the moment that this a great example from Thailand is really like spreading around the world, that you detach access to services from legal status. I fear that this kind of drive of registration, from registration to categorizing population, from categorizing to issuing different proofs of documentation that in turn enable differentiated access to different opportunities, rights, and services, that this is something that is even more and more spreading. Like the amount of documents, the amount of registration. And in essence, like we are a bit, like in this agenda that we're pursuing here, we're trying to catch up on that. We're trying to register faster and issuing more documents. Like in a way, like I wonder whether by catching up, whether we actually ever reach that goal.
Yeah.
So I agree with you that the goal must be like to just not further accelerate that race. I have the impression a lot of countries that I now visit is these kind of different cards and different, you have this in Thailand with the zero cards, they have this in Lebanon with the Maktumin and the different Kailadas, etc. They all have their own cards. So there's lots of cards and lots of documents, but they all mean different things.
Excellent. All right. With that, I am very aware of the time, and unfortunately there never is enough of that. But I want to very much thank all of our esteemed panelists, Christoph, Rehanna, Amanda, Dawn, and Diana. And I'd invite you to give them one more round of applause for their work. All right. And just maybe a word of wrap-up. It looks like one of the main lessons that we can draw from many of these examples is to be wary of early successes, or what might be an early interpretation of a success. And maybe let's be a little bit more creative and challenging in our thinking of what we consider success and movement forward in this area. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.